People always want to know what it felt like the first time I saw it. They lean forward in their chairs, voices dropping the way voices do when someone is about to ask about the dead. They want the fear part. They want the monster. What they don't want, what nobody ever really wants, is the part that came before, the ordinary life that the thing tore through like it didn't matter at all. But that's the part I think about. That's the part that keeps me up at night, even now, years later, when the water at the eastern point is calm, and the charts are correct, and the cave is marked the way it should have been marked a long time ago. I think about what Smallport looked like before. I think about the docks in the early morning, the way the light came across the water before the colony proper woke up, the particular smell of salt and diesel and cold air that I had grown up inside and resented, because it was so thoroughly and completely the smell of a life that wasn't going anywhere. That resentment seems very far away now. I'd give a considerable amount to feel it again, uncomplicated, the way I felt it at 19, standing on the dock watching my father's boats go out, and knowing with complete certainty that I was not going to be watching them for much longer. Smallport was the kind of place that happened to people who didn't leave when they had the chance. A coastal colony on the frontier edge of the Reach, one of about 40 settlements that clung to the archipelago like barnacles on a hull. Fishing boats at the docks, a processing plant that smelled bad in summer, 2 bars that closed at different hours, so there was always somewhere to go if you were that kind of person. The population was approximately 18,000, which is large enough to have institutions and small enough that everyone knows the mayor's name and most people know the mayor's business. The colony had been there for 60 years, which meant it had the particular confidence of a place that has survived long enough to stop worrying about whether it will survive. The infrastructure worked. The water came on when you turned the tap. The harbor authority functioned in the way that harbor authorities function, with bureaucratic consistency and a limited appetite for anything that complicated the paperwork. My father, Roland Reed, ran one of the charter operations, 4 boats, 6 crew on a good season, contracts with the sport fishermen who came out from the interior looking for something to haul in and photograph. He wasn't a complicated man. He knew the water, he knew his crew, and he knew that I was going to leave Smallport the moment I was old enough to make the decision stick. He never said he minded. He probably did. My sister Cicely was 12 that summer. She still thought Smallport was the whole world. She was right in ways that hadn't occurred to either of us yet. I was 19, which is old enough to be bored and young enough to think that boredom is the worst thing that can happen to you. I was wrong about that. I know that now. The thing started with a fishing contest and a man named Decker who my father never liked. Decker was the kind of man the frontier produces in abundance, loud, certain of himself in the way people become certain of themselves when the nearest court of law is 2 days by transit, and nobody is going to argue with a man who has both a temper and a sidearm. He had money from somewhere, or claimed to. He'd hired my father's boat, the Marin, a 40-footer that my father had owned for 11 years, and maintained with the particular attentiveness of a man who understood that a boat was not a possession but a working relationship, and gone out to compete in the seasonal catch prize. Big haul, significant payout. The kind of thing that drew men like Decker to the water when they had no business being there, when the water had never been their element, and they had no patience for what the water required. My father wasn't on board that night. He'd sent Carver, his best captain, a quiet man from the southern islands who'd been working the Reach for 30 years and knew every current by feel, every shoal by memory, every variation in the weather by the way the light changed over the western horizon in late afternoon. Carver was the kind of man who didn't need instruments to do what he did, though he maintained them impeccably because impeccable maintenance was how he understood professional respect. My father trusted Carver with the Marin the way you trust a person with something that matters, not easily, not casually, but fully, once the trust was given. My father was not a man who gave trust easily. He never forgave himself for giving it that particular night, to that particular charter, with that particular passenger aboard. That's not a rational response to what happened. My father knew it wasn't rational. He felt it anyway, the way people feel the things that can't be reasoned out of them, and I never told him to stop because some griefs need to be held the way they are. What happened on the water that night, I pieced together later from the salvage log, from the coast censor records, from a partial statement that the only witness was able to give before he stopped being able to give statements about anything. Decker hooked something significant, a large specimen that would have won the prize, and then some. The kind of catch that men like Decker dream about in the way they dream about everything, as a measure of themselves rather than as an end in itself. And then a predator took it, severed the line and the catch together, clean and fast, the way the big ones do when they've found something already tired and want an easy meal. It wasn't malicious. It was just what the predator was. Decker lost his temper. He opened fire on the predator with a pulse rifle he had no permit for on a charter boat, which tells you everything you need to know about Decker, and also something depressing about the gap between the regulations and the enforcement of them in frontier settlements. Carver tried to stop him. Pelter, the young guide on board, 19 years old, 2 seasons of experience, a kid who had been excited about the work and had told his mother he'd found his calling, tried to put himself between Decker and the water. Decker ignored both of them and kept firing, because Decker was the kind of man who ignored the people who were trying to save him from himself until it was too late for saving to be the operative word. When the creature dove, Decker threw a fragmentation charge after it. The charge detonated below the surface. The sensors recorded the shockwave. The pulse rifle wounds and the shockwave together were enough, and the creature swam into the cave system below the eastern cliffs, a place the old charts marked with a symbol I didn't understand until Finch explained it to me, weeks later, when it was almost too late for the explanation to matter. The cave was below the waterline at high tide but opened into air at low. The charts marked it with a symbol that predated the colonial survey system, that appeared in records from the first contact era, and nobody in the current generation of Smallport residents had any reason to know what the symbol meant, because nobody had thought to look it up. Nobody had thought to look it up because nothing had come out of that cave in living memory, and the memory of a frontier colony is as long as its oldest institutions, and the oldest institution in Smallport was the Harbor Authority, which had been keeping records for 60 years. The cave had been doing what the cave did for considerably longer than 60 years. The creature died in the dark, in the deep water in that particular place. And then it came back. It killed Decker first. That much, I can say, is something like justice, though I am not comfortable with the concept of justice being administered by a dead predator through a mechanism nobody fully understands, and I am even less comfortable with the fact that Pelter and Carver, who had both tried to stop what Decker started, were not spared because of it. The thing that came back from that cave was not distributing consequences according to culpability. It was doing what it was doing, for reasons that mapped onto something much older and simpler than justice. It took Decker off the deck of the Marin in the dark, and Carver saw it happen, saw the water come up over the railing in a shape that shouldn't have been possible, saw it take Decker in a way that left nothing to find. Carver ran for the radio and got a partial transmission out before the thing came back for him too. The transmission was logged and flagged, and the next morning the Coast Authority sent a patrol vessel, and the patrol vessel found the Marin drifting with 2 men missing and Pelter in a state that required immediate medical evacuation. And no explanation that made any sense in the framework that the Harbor Authority was equipped to apply. My father heard about it over the community channel at 0600. He didn't cry. He made coffee, stood at the kitchen window looking at the water, and then he went to file a report with the Harbor Authority. He did it the right way, the procedural way, because he was that kind of man. He thought the system would handle it. Most of us did at first. That's what you do when something terrible happens, and you don't yet understand what you're dealing with. You trust the institution. You wait for someone with more authority to arrive and take charge and make sense of things, because the alternative to trusting the institution is accepting that you are alone with the problem, and most people are not ready to accept that in the first hours after a catastrophe. The institution in this case was a harbor authority run by a man named Mayor Stern, who had been running Smallport for 16 years, and who regarded any disruption to the colony's reputation as a personal attack on himself. Stern told my father the men had probably fallen overboard. He said it with the flat certainty of a man who had decided what had happened and was not interested in other interpretations. He said there would be an investigation. There was not an investigation. There was a press release about maritime safety and a reminder about life jacket protocols. And then Stern went back to whatever it was Stern did when he wasn't managing the narrative of his colony into a shape that reflected well on his administration. I did not yet know about Stern's motivations. I would learn them later from Cameron, who was in a position to explain them with an intimacy that sons develop around the failures of their fathers. What I knew at that point was my father's face at the kitchen table after he came back from the harbor authority, a face that had received information it didn't know how to process through the ordinary channels, and was sitting with that information the way you sit with something that doesn't fit anywhere. The thing came ashore 2 days later. It came to the beach north of the colony center, where a group of young people had gathered the way young people gather in coastal settlements when the weather is right, and there is nowhere better to be, and nothing in the recent record suggests that the water itself might be the problem. My friends were there. Blaze Corin, who I had known since we were children, and who was the kind of person who laughed at things other people found uncomfortable, which I had always considered a gift, and which the situation ahead of us would test in ways I would not have predicted. Taylor Max, who was quieter, more careful, the one who noticed things before the rest of us did, and who processed the world primarily through the question of what to do about it rather than how to feel about it. Cameron Stern, the mayor's son, who was neither his father nor nothing, somewhere between the two, still figuring out which way he was going to fall when the deciding moment arrived. And Mick, who was Cameron's friend, and who I am not going to describe with the cruelty that hindsight allows in a narrator who can see what's coming, because Mick was just a person who went to a beach on a sunny afternoon, and who died in the water before any of us understood what was in the water, and that ought to count for something in the accounting. I wasn't there for that. I was at the docks with my father, helping him file the additional paperwork that the harbor authority kept requesting as a way of appearing to do something, while actually doing nothing that would have caused Stern any inconvenience. I heard about what happened at the beach from Blaze, who called me from the emergency station, while a medic wrapped his forearm, and his voice had the particular flat quality that voices get when a person is still inside the shock, and hasn't yet come out the other side of it into something recognizable. He said something came out of the water. He said it was translucent, faintly luminous, that the shape of it was recognizable but wrong. The geometry of a large marine predator rendered in something that was not quite matter, that the light passed through it in ways that light does not pass through solid things. He said it moved through the water in the shallows, and then through a tide pool, and then through a child's plastic bucket that someone had left on the sand, and that this last part was the detail that broke something in the back of his skull, because nothing that size should fit in a bucket, and yet he had watched it happen. He said it clearly and without embellishment, in the flat voice of a person reporting something they know will be disbelieved. 2 people dead on the beach, 3 hospitalized with wounds that the medical center logged carefully, and then apparently filed in a category that nobody followed up on. The rest scattered across the colony by the time the emergency services arrived. I believed Blaze. I want to say that clearly, because in the weeks that followed, believing Blaze was the only thing that kept me moving in the right direction when every other signal in the environment was pushing toward the easier interpretation. My father believed him too, though he wouldn't say so out loud. Not yet, because my father was a practical man, and practical men require a moment of stillness when the world turns out to be significantly stranger than they were built to expect. Mayor Stern did not believe Blaze. Mayor Stern issued a statement about collective trauma response in the wake of the Marin incident, which was, I will grant him, not an unreasonable hypothesis if you had not heard Blaze's voice on that call, and if you had a strong institutional interest in things being a stress response rather than what they actually were. The thing came back that night. It came to the water treatment facility at the edge of the colony, the large holding tanks where the settlement's water supply cycled through filtration before distribution to every tap and shower and kitchen in Smallport. The facility ran a skeleton crew on the night rotation, 3 people, all of them adults who had worked the system for years and knew it the way you know a thing you've worked around long enough that it stops being something you think about consciously. The facility was infrastructure in the most fundamental sense of the word, the kind of thing that a colony depends on so completely that its continued function becomes invisible, becomes assumed, becomes the background against which everything else happens. They saw the water in Tank 7 begin to behave strangely. They saw the shape that formed within it. One of them survived by climbing the exterior of the tank in the dark, hand over hand up the service ladder, 8 meters of cold metal in a dark that had suddenly become very wrong, and staying there for 4 hours with his arms hooked over the top railing until the thing moved on. The other 2 did not make it to the ladder. I heard about it at 0300 from an alert on my comm. My father heard it at the same time in his room and came out into the kitchen in the dark, and we sat across from each other without turning the lights on, both of us facing the fact that what we were dealing with was not a maritime accident and was not a trauma response, and was not going to be handled by any institution currently functioning in Smallport. I went to see Finch the next morning. His name was Erasmus Finch, and he was the oldest person in Smallport by a margin that people in the colony had stopped tracking precisely, because the number was becoming unsettling in the way that very large numbers associated with a living person become unsettling. He lived in the lighthouse at the eastern point, a structure that had been decommissioned as a navigation aid 40 years prior and repurposed, first as a colonial research station, and then, after Finch occupied it, as the residence of a man who had decided that other people's company was, on balance, more trouble than it was worth. He had books. Physical books, printed and bound, the kind of archival material that serious institutions kept under climate control, and that individuals almost never possessed in the volume that Finch possessed it. He kept his in stacks that reached the ceiling of every room and spilled into the stairwells, organized in a system that was legible only to him, and that he navigated with the ease of someone who has spent so many years in a space that the space has become an extension of his own cognition. I had been inside once before, years earlier, when I was 12 and Cicely was 5, and my father had sent me with a delivery from the colony supply chain. I remembered the smell of the place, old paper, salt air. Something chemical underneath that I couldn't name then and still can't name precisely, though I now associate it with the particular atmosphere of places where old knowledge has been worked over repeatedly by a mind that takes it seriously. I remembered Finch himself as a tall man who moved carefully, the way people move when they are managing a body that has accumulated a significant number of years and is no longer entirely reliable in its feedback. He had looked at me with the particular attention that some old people direct at children, not condescending, not indulgent, just genuinely interested in the specific human standing in front of him, in the way that people are interested in things they find worth examining. He looked at me the same way now, 7 years later, when I knocked on the lighthouse door at first light with the emergency broadcast still cycling through my comm, and the smell of the water on the morning air, and the eastern cliff looming above me in the gray. He already knew why I was there. He told me so before I said a word. He made tea, which was not what I expected from a man I was coming to for help with a crisis, and he sat across from me at a table stacked with open volumes and said, "The cave." I said, "Yes." I told him what Blaze had described. I told him about the water facility. I told him about the harbor authorities' response and Stern's public statements, and the fact that the emergency services were logging incidents without any framework for what the incidents were. Finch listened without interrupting, which is a rare thing in a person and rarer still in a person of his age, who might reasonably have felt entitled to do more of the talking given how much longer he had been alive, and how much more of the relevant history he carried. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. He looked at his tea. He looked at the stacks of books around us with the expression of a man doing a rapid internal inventory. Then he told me about the cave. It was old. Not old in the way that the colony was old, or the way that the settlement infrastructure was old, or even in the way that the archipelago itself was old. Old in the way that the charts marked it, with a symbol that predated the colonial survey system by a significant margin, that appeared in records from the first contact era, that Finch had traced back through 3 separate archival traditions to a period when the only people who knew about the Reach were the people who had lived on it before the colony's ships arrived and began the work of deciding what the place would become. The symbol itself was consistent across all 3 traditions. Same shape, same placement on every chart where it appeared, same cluster of associated notations that Finch had spent years translating from 3 different predecessor languages. The cave did something to things that died inside it. Not to everything, and not always, and the mechanism was not something Finch could explain with any precision that would have satisfied a scientist working in a framework built on repeatable controlled experiments. But the effect was documented across enough independent sources, spanning enough independent time periods, that Finch considered it established fact in the same way that many historical facts are established, through the convergence of sufficient witness accounts to make coincidence an implausible explanation. Things that died in the cave sometimes came back, not alive, not dead, something between those 2 states, occupying a resonance that the cave produced and sustained, which is not a comfortable place to exist and which tends to produce, in whatever comes back, a disposition that is not oriented toward coexistence with whatever killed it. The creature that had died in the cave was not the first. There were records of others. Most of the others had been smaller, and the resonance had collapsed on its own within days, and the damage had been localized and eventually forgotten in the way that localized damage gets forgotten when the infrastructure of memory doesn't prioritize it. The current situation was not smaller. The creature that Decker had wounded was large, and it had been angry before it died. And whatever the cave did to things, it did not do anything to diminish anger. There was also, Finch said, a way to close it. He told me about the grimoire. The word was archaic, and he explained it without condescension as simply a compiled record of specific techniques, not metaphysical, not religious in any way that mapped onto the frameworks I was familiar with, but practical in the way that understanding a circuit and knowing which wire to cut is practical. Someone at some point before the records that Finch had access to had worked out the mechanism of the cave's resonance and had documented a method for collapsing it. The record had been added to over several generations by people who had occasion to use it, and those additions were the most useful parts. The practical notes, the corrections, the marginalia that said this took longer than expected or the second sequence must be spoken aloud, not read silently, and similar refinements that could only have come from people who had actually performed the procedure. The grimoire was in his possession, had been for 30 years, left to him by the previous keeper of the lighthouse, who had held it for 40 years before that, who had received it from the person before, in a chain of custodianship that Finch traced back far enough that the names became unfamiliar and the dating became imprecise. I asked him why he hadn't used it already, given that he'd known what the cave was and what it did. He said, because the last time something came out of that cave, it was small enough to run its course without intervention, and because the grimoire's procedure is specific about who can enact it, not just anyone, the right person, and I have been waiting since the Marin incident to be certain I had identified the right person correctly. I asked him what made a person the right one. He looked at me for a long time over the rim of his tea. He said, the right person is the one who understands the full cost of the procedure and is willing to pay it anyway, not someone who hasn't understood the cost, not someone who has understood it and is hopping for a different accounting, someone who has looked at the number and said yes. I didn't know what that meant then. I thought I did. I was wrong in the way you're wrong when you understand something intellectually before you've understood it in your body, before the weight of it has settled into your chest and become something you carry rather than something you think about. I went back to the colony and told Blaze and Taylor what Finch had told me. Blaze received the information the way he received most things that fell outside normal parameters, with a dark humor that I had always found comforting, and which, on this occasion, I found present without being comforting, like a familiar piece of furniture in a room where the roof has come off. Taylor received it with the focused attention of a person filing away information for later use, already running the logistics in her head before I'd finished speaking. Cameron listened from the doorway of the room, half in and half out, the way he'd been standing in doorways his whole life, his father's son in posture, if not yet in conclusion. We decided, the four of us, to go to Stern. I don't know what I expected. I had grown up in Smallport. I had watched Stern run the colony for 16 years. I knew what he was, not a villain in any dramatic sense, just a man who had made a successful career out of managing information, and who had reached the point in that career where the management of information had become more real to him than the information itself. And yet there is a part of the human brain that keeps trying the official channels even after the evidence suggests the official channels have failed. Because the alternative, accepting that you are on your own, that the institution has reached its limit, and the remaining work belongs to whoever is willing to do it, is a weight that most people are not ready to pick up in their hands and carry without being forced to. Stern received us in his office with the measured courtesy of a man who understood that dismissing people too quickly created its own problems. He sat behind his desk in the chair that had been his for 16 years, with the comfort of occupancy that long tenure produces. He listened to everything I said. He looked at the documentation I had compiled, the sensor logs from the Marin incident, the medical reports from the beach, the water facility incident report, the cross-reference chart data on the cave, the partial translation of the old symbols associated notations that Finch had given me. Then he told me that the colony did not have room for this kind of speculation. He said it without anger, which was more chilling than anger would have been. He said that Smallport's contracts with the fishing cooperatives were up for seasonal renewal, that the tourism charter operations were already down 20% following the Marin incident, that 3 of the colony's major investors were currently in negotiation over infrastructure expansion, and that the introduction of a narrative involving a supernatural predator into the colony's public information environment would be, in his assessment, categorically irresponsible and economically catastrophic. He told us to go home. Cameron, standing behind me, said, "Dad." Stern looked at his son. Something moved across his face that was not entirely the face of an administrator, a father looking at a son who is looking back at him with an expression that says he knows what his father is. That specific transaction between a parent and a child who has grown old enough to see clearly. Then the expression was gone and the administrator was back, and he told us again to go home. We went. That evening, the thing came to the colony center. It came through the storm drain system that ran under the main plaza, a network of channels that carried runoff from the settlement's hard surfaces down to the harbor. Infrastructure so standard and so invisible that the colony's residents no more thought about it than they thought about the soil under the foundations. It came up through a grate in the plaza at the height of the evening social hour, when the weather had brought people outside after 2 days of staying in, when the plaza was full of the ordinary noise and motion of a community doing what communities do when there is no immediate reason not to. It moved through a puddle left by the afternoon's rain, through a decorative water feature at the center of the plaza that the colony had installed 10 years prior as part of an aesthetic improvement initiative, through the gutters along the main street, where the runoff from the previous days, weather still ran in a shallow channel. I was not there. I was at Finch's lighthouse, going through the grimoire with him, learning the sequences, understanding the timing, asking the questions that the marginal notations raised. Blaze was with me. Taylor had gone back to check on her younger siblings, who she was responsible for in a way she never complained about. Cameron had gone to his father's office for reasons he hadn't explained to any of us, and which I would understand later. Finch and I heard the emergency tones on the colony broadcast. We heard the numbers: 6 people in the plaza, 3 in the main street, a child who had been playing in a puddle near the residential blocks, and the broadcast didn't finish that particular item, just moved to the next, which told me what I needed to know. Blaze went very still beside me. He had a particular way of going still when something was too large to process with his usual methods, humor failing him. The mechanism that normally converted his discomfort into something bearable, suddenly unable to operate at the scale required. He went still and looked at the floor and was, for a moment, just a person with the weight of it on him. I kept reading. This is the part people don't understand when they ask what it felt like. They want the paralysis, the moment where everything becomes too much, the breaking point. What they don't account for is that the breaking point is a luxury available to people who are not in the middle of the only solution to the problem. The fear was there. It lived behind my sternum like a stone, and it grew heavier with every name the broadcast read out, and I am not going to pretend it didn't. But the paralysis didn't come, because the alternative to reading was not reading, and if I stopped reading then people kept dying, and that was an arithmetic my brain refused to accept regardless of how heavy the stone got. So I kept reading, and Finch beside me watched me work through it. He said quietly, when I reached the section he'd been waiting for me to reach, "You understand what it requires?" I said yes. He said, "Say it out loud, so I know you understand it as a fact and not just as text." I said, "Whoever closes the resonance has to go into the water, into the cave itself, and the cave doesn't release whatever closes it." He nodded. I said, "Because the resonance requires an anchor, something that stays in the place where the thing opened. And the anchor has to be something new. It can't be the creature, because the creature already left, which is the entire problem we're solving." He said, "Yes. The closure requires an anchor with enough coherence to hold the resonance closed. The creature no longer has that coherence. The cave will take what it needs from whatever performs the closure." I said, "So the person who closes it doesn't come back?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been holding this knowledge for 30 years. I have told it to exactly 2 other people in that time, both of them in situations less critical than this one, and both of them immediately began looking for a way around the requirement. I watched them look. Neither of them found one, and both of them eventually ran out of time. I said, "I'm still looking for a way around it." He said, "I know. Tell me when you find it." He said it without sarcasm. He meant it, in the way that someone means something when they have been looking for the same answer for 30 years, and would genuinely welcome news of its existence. I didn't find one. I went through the grimoire twice more that night, every marginal note, every edition from every previous practitioner, and I didn't find one. What I found instead was the bloodline clause. The closure had to be enacted by someone connected to the specific chain of events that had opened the resonance. Not the person directly responsible, Decker was dead, which the grimoire addressed as a contingency, but someone within the causal thread, the owner of the vessel, a blood descendant of the owner. My father's boat, my father. Or me. I sat with that for a long time. The emergency broadcast was still cycling. The numbers from the plaza had stopped climbing, which meant either the thing had moved on for the night or the emergency services had reached everyone there was to reach. I sat at Finch's table with the grimoire in front of me and the stone behind my sternum and ran the arithmetic. My father had a 12-year-old daughter who still thought Smallport was the whole world. That left one of us. I didn't tell Blaze what the bloodline clause said. Not that night. He could read my face well enough to know something had shifted, but I told him I needed to think, and he accepted that because he was, despite his methods, an intelligent person who understood when not to push. I would tell him later after, and he would be angry at me for keeping it from him, and I understood why, and I believe to this day that under the same circumstances he would have done exactly the same thing I did. Some people you protect, not because they need protecting, but because they are the people left who make the future worth arriving at. I told Finch I would be back before low tide the following night. He said, I know. I said, how? He said, because you're still here, asking questions, rather than trying to run from the problem. People who run from the problem don't make appointments. I went back to the colony, and I found my father at the Harbor Authority office, which had become, by that point, an unofficial crisis center as the news from the plaza spread, and the emergency services tried to build a picture of what they were dealing with out of incident reports that didn't cohere into anything their training had equipped them to address. He was sitting at a table with 3 other people, all of them speaking in the controlled, even voices that people use when managing a situation significantly beyond their preparation. He saw my face when I came through the door. He stood up without finishing his sentence. I took him to the dock in the dark, with the water moving quietly below us and the colony's lights reflected in broken fragments on the surface. I told him everything, all of it. Finch and the cave and the grimoire and the bloodline clause and what the closure required. I told him in sequence, without softening any of it, because my father was not a man who benefited from information being softened. He had always been better served by knowing exactly what was in front of him, even when what was in front of him was bad. He listened the way he always listened, still, attentive, his eyes on mine, his hands at his sides. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. The water moved below us. Somewhere out in the harbor, a buoy knocked against the dock with a slow, irregular rhythm. Then he said, I'll do it. I said no. He said very evenly, Ava, you are 19 years old. I said, and Cicely is 12. She needs one of us, Dad. She needs to still have one of us when this is done. He started to say something. I watched him construct the argument, test it, find the place where it broke against the same arithmetic I had already run, and come out the other side of it into a place that looked like acceptance from the outside but was not acceptance. Was something harder than acceptance, something that a parent goes through when they understand that their child has already made the decision, and the decision is the right one, and the only thing left is whether to fight it or to stand beside it. His jaw set, he looked at the water. He said, the grimoire describes the full procedure in sufficient detail. I said, yes. He said, and Finch is certain about the bloodline requirement. I said, Finch is certain about everything. It's honestly the most alarming thing about him. Something shifted in his face, not a smile, close to one. He said, you are not going alone. I said, Dad. He said, that is not a discussion. That is where the negotiation ends. Where you go, I go to the door. That is final. I said yes, all right, yes. He said good, then let's go get Blaze. Blaze drove us to the eastern point without asking questions, which told me he had understood enough of what was coming to know that the questions he wanted to ask were not the kind that would be answered in a car on a dark road. Taylor met us on the coastal road she'd called ahead, or Blaze had, I'm still not sure which, and she had a bag of supplies that turned out to contain exactly what the situation required, because Taylor always had exactly what the situation required and never made a performance of knowing this about herself. Cameron met us at the base of the cliff path with his father's emergency access codes and the colony's service tender ready at the lower dock. He'd taken the codes without asking and without leaving a note, which was, I thought, the direction he'd finally decided to fall. I didn't say that to him. I didn't need to. We waited on the cliff for the tide to fall. The broadcasts continued out of our comms, quieter now, the active incident response transitioning into the grim administrative work of accounting. I sat next to Blaze on the cold rock and he said, "You know I would have gone with you." I said, "I know." He said, "Into the cave part, I mean, if you told me about the bloodline clause." I said, "I know, Blaze." He said, "Just so you know that I know what you did." I said, "I know." He put his arm around my shoulders, his forearm across my back, the weight of it familiar in the way that the physical presence of someone you've known your entire life is familiar, not something you think about until it occurs to you that you might not always have access to it. I let myself sit inside that for a moment. Then I stood up, because the tide was moving and we had work to do. The cave entrance was below the waterline at high tide, but at low water it opened into a shallow arch in the cliff face, wide enough for the service tender to pass through. Carver would have known this cave by sight and probably by name. He'd probably tried to warn Decker when Decker fired the first shot, and the creature dove toward the cliffs. It would have been one more thing Decker didn't listen to. We went through in the tender. The bioluminescence was extraordinary blue-green light coming off the wet rock walls, off the water, a cold and precise illumination that had no warmth in it and no flicker, that showed everything with the clarity of something that had been waiting in the dark for a very long time and was accustomed to it. The arch gave way to a chamber larger than the exterior suggested, much larger, the ceiling lost in shadow above us, and the walls curving away in both directions into dark. The water in the center of the chamber was completely still. The resonance was visible. I had not expected it to be visible, though the grimoire had described it, a shimmer in the air above the water, like heat distortion but vertical, rising from the surface in a column that bent the light around it in a way that made the eye want to slide off it rather than focus. Everyone in the tender could see it. Nobody said anything for a moment. My father looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at me. There was nothing performative in his expression. Just my father looking at me the way he had looked at me my whole life, like someone paying close attention to a person they intend to know as well as they possibly can for as long as they possibly can. He said, "Tell me the procedure, or you need me to stand." I told him. He listened without asking me to repeat anything. He said, "The book stays in your hands." I said, "Yes." He said, "And after, what happens after?" I said, "Secondary closure." Finch gave me the notation. The Harbor Authority record has to be corrected with the right chart symbol and the right cross-reference. The cave access marked restricted with specific conditions. Someone has to carry that forward and make sure it stays in the permanent record. He said, "Cameron has the access." I said, "Yes." He nodded. He was thinking about something. I did not ask what. Some things belong to the person thinking them, and there was nothing I could have said that would have been adequate to whatever he was carrying in that moment. He said, "Your mother would have been extremely frustrated with both of us right now." I said, "She would have found a way around the bloodline clause. She would have spent 3 days in Finch's library and come out with a different answer." He almost smiled, He stepped forward to the edge of the tender, at the boundary of the still water, and I opened the grimoire and began the sequence. It took longer than I expected. Finch had told me to allow for this. The grimoire's time references were calibrated to rhythms that had to be felt rather than counted, and the finding of those rhythms was itself part of the work. I found them, or I told myself I found them, and the distinction may not matter. My voice stayed steady. It stayed steady because it was required to stay steady, and I had been given, by some arrangement of circumstance, a set of resources, stubbornness, primarily, and the particular kind of focus that comes from having no alternative, that happened to include the ability to do what was required of me in the specific moment it was required. My father stood at the water's edge and did not move. The shimmer in the column changed. Slowly at first, the way large things begin to change, not fast, not dramatic, but with a weight that registered in the chest before it registered in the eye. The bioluminescence on the cave walls dimmed. The water in the center of the chamber began to rotate, a slow movement building from the surface down. The thing came up. It came from the depth of the black water in the shape that Blaze had described to me on the phone, translucent, luminous, the geometry of a large predator, but rendered in something between matter and the absence of matter, something that the light passed through and around. It was larger in the cave than the reports had suggested, much larger. It moved through the water toward the surface with a patience that nothing of that size should have possessed, and it carried with it, in the quality of its movement, in something that I cannot call expression, but cannot call its absence either, the specific weight of something that has not finished being angry. My father stood at the water's edge. He did not step back. I want to be precise about this. He was not performing courage. Roland Reed had never in his life performed anything. He stood where he was because he had decided to stand there, the same way he made every decision, not dramatically, not with any particular consciousness of what he was modeling for anyone watching, just the simple placement of himself in the location the situation required. The thing rose out of the dark water in front of him, and he stood and looked at it. And what was in his face was not fear, and was not bravery, but was something older and simpler than either of those. The steady attention of a man who has worked beside difficult and dangerous things for 30 years and knows that the first requirement is to see clearly. I kept reading. The sequence reached the central movement, the part Finch had been most careful about, the part with the most accumulated marginalia from previous practitioners, the part where the rhythm of the spoken procedure had to match the rhythm of the resonance's own oscillation. I found the rhythm. I read into it. The column above the water contracted, slowly, the shimmer pulling inward toward the source point in the rock below the chamber. The thing felt it. It turned in the water, not toward me, toward my father because he was the anchor point, because the bloodline requirement operated in both directions. And whatever the thing understood about the situation, it understood that the person standing at the water's edge was the reason the door was closing. My father held. He held the way he held everything, without display, without retreat. I read the final sequence. The column of shimmer imploded. There is no other word for it, not an explosion, not a dissipation, but a collapse inward, a sudden and complete withdrawal of whatever property had made it visible and present and real. The cave went dark for 3 full seconds, the bioluminescence extinguished entirely, the darkness so complete that I could feel its weight. Then the glow came back, dimmer than before, soft and ambient on the wet rock, and the water in the center of the chamber was still. Completely still. Unremarkably, ordinarily still. My father was standing at the edge of the tender. I exhaled. The sound of it was very loud in the silence. Nobody spoke. Blaze had his hand over his mouth, his eyes on my father's back. Taylor was watching the water with the focused attention she directed at anything that required verification before she would accept it. Cameron was holding the gunwale with both hands, his knuckles pale in the low light. My father turned around. He looked at me, then at the closed grimoire in my hands, then at me again. He said, I thought. I said, so did I. He said, the bloodline requirement. I said, required someone to enact the procedure. It didn't specify anything about staying. The anchor the cave needed was the procedure itself, the active closure of the resonance. The person who performs it doesn't constitute the anchor. The completion of the act does. He looked at me for a long time. He said, you knew that when you told me I would go to the door. I said, I knew it when I left the lighthouse. I wanted you here. I needed you here. I didn't know until the second reading whether the closure was survivable, and I didn't tell you what I didn't know because you would have spent the night trying to figure out how to go in instead of me, and I couldn't have done what I needed to do if I was spending the same night trying to stop you from doing that. He was quiet. He turned back toward the still water, and he stood there with his back to us for a moment, looking at the place where the shimmer had been. His shoulders were set in the way they set when he was managing something he hadn't yet decided how to put into language. Then he turned back and came to sit beside me in the tender, and we were all quiet together in the dim, bioluminescent light of the cave for a while, listening to the water and to nothing else, because there was nothing else to listen to. Getting out was straightforward. The tide was still low. Blaze took the tiller without being asked and brought us through the arch and into the open water, and the night air came down on us cold and clear, the stars over the reach bright and far away, the colony's lights in the distance like a second constellation closer to the ground. I checked my comm. The emergency broadcast had gone quiet sometime in the last 30 minutes. No new incidents. The response services standing down from active calls to assessment and accounting. I didn't read Stern's statement. I didn't need to. Taylor was already working, her comm active, building what she could in the way of documentation and resource mapping for the morning. Cameron was calling someone, I don't know who, and I didn't ask. Blaze steered. My father sat beside me and was quiet in the particular way he was quiet. When he was thinking through something he would not say immediately but would say eventually, when he'd found the right shape for it. After a while he put his hand on my shoulder, not heavily, just there. He kept his hand there for the rest of the crossing. Finch was awake when we climbed the cliff path to the lighthouse, which none of us had doubted. He sat in his chair with a volume open on his lap and a cup of cold tea at his elbow, and he looked at the five of us standing in his doorway and nodded once, the nod of a man who has received the information he was waiting for and is now ready to proceed to the next item. He said, the charts. I said, yes. We spent the next 2 hours at his table, working through the documentation that would need to exist in the permanent record of Smallport, the corrected notation on the survey charts, the cross-reference to the appropriate archival source, the harbor authority flag on the cave approach with the conditions of restriction, worded precisely enough to be followed by someone who didn't know the history and broadly enough to remain relevant across administrative changes. Cameron had his father's codes. He used them without hesitation, which I noted and respected. My father did the actual chart work, because my father understood charts and harbor documentation the way he understood the boats, from the inside precisely, without needing to think about it. By the time the sky at the eastern horizon began shifting from black into the dark gray that precedes color, the record was complete. Finch reviewed it twice. He said it was correct. This was, I understood, not a casual endorsement. We left separately. Blaze drove Taylor. Cameron walked. My father and I walked the coastal road together, the way we had walked it 100 times over the years, the water on our left and the colony lights on our right, and the cold air carrying the salt smell that I had grown up associating with limitation and smallness. It didn't smell like that. I am not sure it will ever smell like that again. Somewhere on the coastal road, with the light just beginning to come into the eastern sky, my father said, "You're still leaving." It wasn't a question. I said yes. He said, "Good." And then, after a moment, Smallport is going to need people who have done what you've done tonight. Not here, elsewhere, in the bigger rooms, with larger problems that need someone willing to read the full accounting before deciding what they can afford. I said, that's a generous interpretation. He said, it's the accurate one. I'm not being generous. I'm being your father, which is a different thing. I didn't answer that. There was nothing to say that would have been adequate, and he knew it, and the silence between us was not the silence of something unresolved, but of something that had resolved into a shape that didn't need language. We walked the rest of the way home. Cicely was asleep, 12 years old, sleeping the deep, uncomplicated sleep of someone for whom the world is still, mostly, the size she thinks it is. My father stood in her doorway the way he stood in doorways, not entering, just looking, and then went to his room. I sat at the kitchen table until full light. Here is what I know, from this side of it. The thing that came back from that cave was not evil in any way the word is useful. It was wounded and it was angry, and it came back the way things come back when they've been hurt badly enough that dying doesn't fully address it. The people who died in Smallport didn't die because the universe hates us. They died because a man with a temper and no patience and an unregistered pulse rifle shot at something in a place he didn't understand, and the consequences of that moved outward in directions he never lived to see. The way consequences always move when someone acts without understanding where they are. That's the shape of it. It's not a satisfying shape. It doesn't have the clean lines of a story where the right people suffer and the wrong people are spared. What it has is the weight of things that actually happened, and the particular kind of knowledge you acquire when you've had to sit with that weight and decide what to do about it anyway. What I also know is this: the door is closed. The record is correct. The cave is marked the way it should have been marked before any of this started, and the mark will stay in the permanent record of Smallport for as long as the Harbor Authority keeps records, which is the only kind of permanence a frontier colony has to offer and which will have to be enough. Blaze is alive. Taylor is alive. Cameron is alive. My father is alive. Cicely is 12 years old and will continue to be whatever she becomes, which is the best possible outcome of any night like that one. Finch is alive, which I consider separately, because Finch occupies a category of his own. 18,000 people in a coastal colony, who will never know what happened in a tidal cave at low water during a night in the late season. That's enough. That has to be enough, and it is enough. And I know it is enough because I have had years now to check the accounting, and the numbers come out the same every time. I left Smallport 4 months later, as I had always intended. I came back the following spring, which I had not intended. I have come back every year since. My father's boats still run the charters. He has new crew. He talks about Carver occasionally, carefully, the way you talk about a loss that has been lived with long enough to become part of the landscape rather than a wound, present named, not gone, but carried in a way that doesn't prevent the carrying of everything else. Cicely is 16 now. She's beginning to look at the edge of the horizon the way I used to look at it. I haven't told her to hurry. I haven't told her there's more beyond it than she thinks. She'll find that out herself, at the right time, in the right way. And I'll be here or I'll come back, which amounts to the same thing.